Alright, hey guys, so this is the video on SSS and SAS proofs. Before we totally dive into how to actually write a proof, I want to make sure that we are all pretty comfortable with identifying whether two triangles are congruent or not. Because you can't prove to me that two triangles are congruent if you can't decide if they even are congruent or not. Alright? So we've got our four postulates or theorems. We've got side, 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 angle, or angle, angle, side. And we're going to try and decide whether these 8 triangles, or 8 sets of triangles, are actually congruent or not. If they're not, we'll just write none, okay? So take a look at number 1. We've got a tick mark here and here. That gives us one set of sides. We've got 2 tick marks here to show us another set of sides. And hopefully you guys are now becoming pros at identifying that shared side, that reflexive property, and hopefully you can see that that third side is shared, and so it is congruent to itself, which means we've got 3 sets of congruent sides. These triangles are congruent by side, side, side. I feel like that's sometimes the easiest one to identify, right? I hope you guys agree with me. So, second set of triangles. We've got a tick mark here and here to show us that those are congruent, and I'm going to highlight these a little bit. And then I have another set of congruent sides right here. So those 2 sides are congruent to each other. And then, ooh, check out the angles that are congruent. Those blue angles. Well, when you look at it, they're all right in a row, right? The blue angle is included in between my 2 congruent sides. So 1, 2, 3 right in a row, I'm okay to say side angle side. Remember, it only works though when that congruent angle is included in between your 2 sets of congruent sides. So be very, very careful, okay? Set 3. We've got angles here that are congruent. We've got angles here, so 3 sets, those are congruent. And then 2 arc marks, those are congruent. So I have 3 sets of congruent angles, but unfortunately, that does not get me congruent triangles. Having AAA does not show congruence for the triangles. It shows similarity, which we'll talk about next semester, but it's not one of our choices up here, right? I can't have 3 sets of congruent angles. That does me no good for now. All right, on to number 4. I have an angle here and here. Those angles are congruent to each other. And then I have that these purple angles are congruent to each other. And hopefully you see right away that very similarly to number 1, we've got this shared side. The blue side, right, the side that we said is congruent by reflexive property, is in between my 2 sets of congruent angles, right? I have the orange angle, the blue side, and the purple angle. The orange angle, the blue side, and the purple angle. It always goes 1, 2, 3, right, for both of my triangles. So this one I can go right in order then. Angle, side, angle. And it's different than angle, angle, side, right? So be very careful with that, please. Question number 5. All right, so I've got congruent angles here and here. Cool. And then hopefully you guys can pull that, hey, you've got a right angle here and a right angle here. And we know that right angles are always congruent, so that's another set of angles. And then, man, again, that reflexive property. So we have a side that's congruent. But now check out that side. That blue side is not in between my purple and orange angles like it was in number 4, right? Take a look at that difference. Here, blue side is in between my 2 congruent angles. Here, blue side not in between my 2 congruent angles, which means this one is not ASA, it's got to be angle, angle, side. They go in order here, AAS. Or, I mean, if you see it as SAA, you know, if you read it from here to here, that's okay. But we do write it as angle, angle, side. All right, but it's clear that that side is not included in between our 2 angles. Okay? Question 6. We have one tick mark here and here to show me congruent sides. Cool. We have 2 tick marks here to show us congruent sides. Awesome sauce. And then number 6, we've also got, hopefully you guys can see that bow tie shape. Bow tie tells me I've got vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent to each other. Look at the blue angle. It's in between my orange and purple sides, right? It's a lot like number 2. They're oriented a little differently, right? But the blue angle is in between my 2 different sides. So I'm cool there. That one must be side angle side. Question 7. Let's take a look here. We have 2 tick marks here and 2 tick marks here. So I've got one set of congruent sides. Cool. And 3 tick marks, 3 tick marks. That tells me congruent sides there. And check out your blue angles that are congruent. Cool, I've got angles. So when I look at this first triangle, the blue angle is between my orange and purple sides. So side angle side, right? Ooh, but look at the second triangle. My blue angle is not in between my 2 congruent sides. This one is not showing me side angle side. So even though this one is, if they're not both set up the same, it doesn't work. These triangles are not congruent either. Okay. And the last one, question 8, we've got a set of angles right here that are congruent. So cool, congruent angles. And I've got a set of sides that have 2 tick marks. So I've got a side. And hopefully you see that bow tie shape. So we've got congruent angles there thanks to vertical angles, and they're always congruent. So take a second, try and decide. I've got 2 angles and a side. So is it like number 4? Is it ASA? Or is it like number 5? Is it AAS? So take a second, see if you can decide which one it is. The answer for that is that it is angle, angle, side. The congruent angle is not, or the congruent side, excuse me, is not in between my 2 congruent angles. All right, so because the 3 things are not all in order, it's angle, angle, side, not angle, side, angle. So it's more like number 5. Okay? All right, now that that is out of the way, let's take a look at this actual proof. Okay, you guys have heard a lot about these so far, but we haven't actually done one. So now we are going to do it. So one thing I want to point out, in a proof you're always given a certain set of information and we are trying to prove a certain thing. In this case we're given 2 sets of congruent segments and we're trying to prove congruent triangles. So before we even get into the mess of writing the proof, I want to see if we actually can see that these triangles are congruent to each other. So I've got BS is congruent to CS. Those are segments. Segment BS is congruent to segment CS. So BS is right here and CS is right here. Okay, so that's a set of congruent sides. Okay, let's see what else we know. Segment AS, so segment AS is congruent to segment DS. Okay, I'm going to put 2 tick marks there because they're congruent to each other, but they're not necessarily congruent to the BS and CS, right? So I want to make sure I have different marks there. Alright, so far I have 2 sets of congruent sides, but that's all they gave me, right? So what else can I do with that? Well, hopefully you guys can look at this and you can see that we've got a bow tie shape, which means we've got vertical angles. And we know that vertical angles are always congruent to each other, so we can mark that in there. And then, hey, hopefully we can agree then that the triangles are congruent by side angle side. Right, so it's exactly like the ones up above, 1 through 8. It's just that instead of marking the information for you, I gave it to you in words and in symbols, and you had to mark it yourself and decide, right? So now the problem is going to be actually putting it into words. Okay, so we're taking it from I gave you all the markings in the picture to I'm making you mark it on your own. Now we're going to actually write it out in words. Okay, so when we write a proof, these are called 2-column proofs. We always have our statements on the left and our reasons on the right. Your statements are always going to be specific to your problem that you're solving. Your reasons are always going to be generic. Okay, your reasons are going to be things like given, or what some of our if-then statements, or reflexive property, or vertical angles, things like that. Your reasons are always going to be generic. They can be used in any proof that we write, whereas our statements are going to be specific to the problem that we're working on. Okay? So these are going to be specific. Let's write that just so we don't lose it. Specific, and your reasons are always going to be generic. Okay, meaning that they can be used on anything. All right, so to start a proof, we always just start with our givens. So we were given that segment BS is congruent to segment CS. And the reason for that, how do we know it? Why were we able to mark it in the diagram? Because it was given to us. It's as simple as that. All right. Second thing, well, we were given also that AS is congruent to segment DS. Cool. That was also given. Right? Nothing special about either of those. Why do we mark them in the diagram? Well, because we were told that we could, right? Well, look at your diagram. What else did you mark? We also marked these purple angles congruent to each other, right? So let's actually write that. Careful, you need to have 3 letters here. So angle BSA is congruent to angle CSD. CSD, Miss J. There we go. Okay, well, why were we able to mark that those two angles were congruent? Hopefully you guys are saying because they're vertical angles, Miss J. Well, we need to put it into nice words, right? We need to be able to say why exactly they're congruent to each other. And we want it to be generic. Okay, so the reason that those are congruent is because they're vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent, right? So our reason is just vertical angles are congruent. Right? Very generic, very to the point. We know that those are vertical angles because of the bow tie shape. We get to just pull that out of the diagram. We don't have to actually say that they're vertical angles, which is kind of nice. But we do need to say that vertical angles are congruent. Okay? Well, now I've got my sides that I had marked. I've got my angles that I marked. Well, now I can just go to what I'm trying to prove. Right? It says prove that these two triangles are congruent. Well, I just did. Right? So triangle BSA is congruent to triangle CSD. And why did we say that they're congruent to each other? Well, we did that before we even started writing anything, right? We said it's by side angle side. Okay? That's it. All we did was take the given information and then we pulled some vertical angles, okay? But you write what you're given, you write what you pulled, and then you write your proof. Okay? They're not all going to be this short, right? They are going to get a little bit more involved. But hopefully that kind of makes sense to you. Okay? We're going to do the next one. So go ahead and go to number 10. Okay, so on number 10, we're given that T is the midpoint of segment SR. Segment SP is congruent to segment RP, and we're trying to prove triangle PST congruent to triangle PRT. So again, before we even start writing anything, I want to see whether I can get to here or not before I do anything over here. I don't want to prove two triangles congruent and then get stuck, right? Or start proving two triangles congruent and get stuck. So I'm going to start with what I'm given, okay? Well, T is the midpoint of segment SR. How do I mark that in my diagram? Okay, well, midpoint, hopefully you guys can tell me that means I get two congruent segments. So I want to mark my congruent segments in my picture. Okay, well, T is the midpoint of SR. That must mean then that ST is congruent to RT. So I have one set of congruent sides. So that's cool, right? Okay, what else am I given? SP is congruent to RP. So segment SP is congruent to segment RP. Okay, that's another set of congruent sides. And hopefully you can pull from that diagram that we've got reflexive property. So cool. We've got 3 sets of congruent sides. So how are these triangles congruent to each other? Well, they're definitely congruent by side, side, side. Well, that's nothing new to you guys, right? We've marked diagrams before with this stuff, and we've been working on identifying whether triangles are congruent or not and how they are. That's not new. The new part is the writing it over here, right? So let's start with our givens, okay? The first thing we were given is that T is the midpoint of SR. So T is the midpoint of SR. Notice that I abbreviated that a little bit, right? I literally just put T, mid PT, segment SR. That's totally okay. As long as I know what it is you're getting at, I'm good with you abbreviating. But pause for a second, because we said that being a midpoint gives us 2 congruent segments, right? So what did we mark in the diagram? We marked that ST is congruent to TR. So before I even write my other given, I'm going to write that. Because T being the midpoint, yeah, that's cool and all, but how did that help me with anything? It helped me mark these 2 congruent segments. So I'm going to jump to that right away. ST is congruent to TR. And why do we know that? Why were we able to say that? Well, it's because it's a midpoint, right? So I want a generic reason for being able to mark these 2 segments congruent, and it's because we have a midpoint. So if midpoint, then 2 congruent segments, right? That's the definition of a midpoint, is that it gives us 2 congruent segments. So the given was that T is the midpoint of segment SR, and what did that do? That gave me that ST is congruent to TR because it's a midpoint. Remember, our reasons need to be generic. They need to be the definitions of things. They're almost always going to be if something, then something else. Okay? All right, well, that was my first given. That was the blue one, right? Cool. And I marked the diagram. Awesome. Well, then I was given that segment SP, so SP is congruent to segment RP, and that was given, right? So I can just write given. And I marked that in the diagram. I don't have to pull anything else from that, so that's cool. What else did you mark in the diagram though, guys? Right, that's only 2 sets of sides. That's my blue sides, that's right here. And then it was my orange sides. Well, we also marked the green ones, right? So we need to say then that those segments are congruent. So TP is congruent to TP. And why were we able to say that? Well, we were able to say that because of reflexive property. Okay. Well, now, look at that. Now we've got side, side, side. We just proved that the triangles were congruent. So step 5 is going to be that triangle PST is congruent to triangle PRT. And why do we know that? What's our reason? Our reason is the postulate that we decided earlier. Side, side, side. Now check and make sure you agree with the order of those triangles, by the way. So PST, my bad guys, so I went orange, blue, and then technically green. Congruent to triangle PRT, so PRT, yep, I went the same order, orange, blue, green. So I'm good to go, right? I know that they're actually in the right order, which is a good thing. I know this is a lot, guys. I know that it seems a little weird. You guys are going to do some practice in class. Don't worry about it. We will get through it together. Just remember that statements are always going to be specific to your proof, and the reasons are always going to be generic. Okay, they're always going to be things like definitions and postulates and theorems. All right, so we will do tons of practice, don't you worry, and then in a couple of days we will dive into doing proofs with angle, side, angle, and angle, angle, side. I will see you guys later. All right, bye.